This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Wondery.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy. I'm cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. One purchased equals one donated. Now go to bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/Wondery and use code WONDERY at checkout.
I'm Lola Blanc.
And I'm Megan Elizabeth.
And we're the hosts of Trust Me, the podcast about cults, extreme belief, and the abuse of power.
Now on Podcast 1.
We're real-life cult survivors.
And we're here to tell you anyone can join a cult.
If you've ever dived headfirst into a new self-help program,
or believed wholeheartedly in a spiritual practice,
or even just trusted someone with your life,
guess what? You're just as susceptible as everyone else.
No one is safe, especially not Megan.
I'm the most susceptible.
We want to debunk the myth that people who join cults are uneducated or naive or broken, because anyone can be manipulated by a narcissist or feel good in a new group they've joined.
And we should know we both have been.
Join us every week as we explore the world of extreme belief,
talk to survivors and experts,
and share our own experiences with cults and the abuse of power.
Don't be fooled. You might be next.
Get new episodes of Trust Me every Wednesday on Podcast 1, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere you get your podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, a Native American woman disappears and her family fights to keep the world from forgetting. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my far-out co-host, Alice.
Hi, Brett. How far out am I? Like, really,
So
how far
far
removed am I from, like, sanity in my sleep-deprived state?
Whatever, Alice. We know that even sleep-deprived, you are more sane than most of us. And that was from Basil, who is one of the students that we talked to at Lidditz Elementary. They were helping me with some descriptors for Alice, and they're all very good.
I loved those students. I hope they enjoyed listening to the Cosmonauts episode, and they should feel so proud because, man, that episode was, heavily drawn upon their input. And I always love doing that. So I hope we get to do it again next year.
Me too. I agree 100%, Alice. And, that was a great episode. And even though it involved some tragedy and some questionable actions by the Russian government, it was fun. And we released it right after the Murdoch case. And so it was nice to have a little bit of a respite from the dark and depressing. Unfortunately, today we are returning to the more downer episodes, which the thing about true crime is usually there's someone suffering. And today we have one of those cases that it's absolutely critical that this case get out there. This is definitely one of those somebody knows something cases, but it also is indicative of a bigger problem. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to do it. We're doing the case of Ashley Loring Heavyrunner today. And this is a case that has become, I think, somewhat more famous recently. Payne Lindsay from Up and Vanished did an entire season on this case. Alice and I had been looking at this case for a while and decided, let's hold off doing it until he was able to sort of do his investigation in the hopes that maybe they would solve the case, maybe they would find something. But this is just one of those that's disturbingly intractable, and they still have not made the kind of progress we'd like to have. So it's a case we definitely wanted to talk about and wanted to shine a light on in the hopes that somebody out there who does know something can bring that knowledge to the forefront.
And Brett, this is a really important case, not just because it's yet another, unfortunately, missing person case, but it shines a lot of light on kind of the different issues we have at play here. You know, this takes place on an Indian reservation, the different kind of overlapping, yet also completely not overlapping jurisdictions, and the result it has on different types of investigations on kind of these Indian tribes. It reminded me of a great novel, Brett. I don't know if you've read it before, but it's called The Roundhouse by, let me see, I think it's Louise Erdrich. It's a beautiful novel, and it's about a devastating crime that happens to a young boy's mother. And it kind of takes you through the court system, but from a child's perspective. And it explores these kind of atrocities that many tribal Indian women face, and also the lack of justice that comes because of the unique situation in which there's the Indian jurisdiction, there's the federal jurisdiction, there's even state issues at play, and there's a bit of a hot potato issue where, you know, the investigations and the judicial system is just passed from one jurisdiction to the next without justice ever really coming to the victims of the crime or their families. And it's heartbreaking, but really enlightening. So if you guys haven't read this book, I highly recommend it. It's been a few years since I've read it, but it came out, I think, maybe about 10 years ago, and made a big splash then, but we're bringing it back now. so go read it if you haven't already read it.
And I know Alice and I have talked about this book before, The Killers of the Flower Moon, which is set about 100 years ago, and just goes to show that these kind of problems on reservation land and people being taken advantage of and the laws not being applied fairly and equally, it's not a new problem. One thing that I think is good is this has gotten a lot more attention. There's been a lot of focus on missing and murdered Indigenous women, to the point that there's a hashtag about this, and there have been some congressional investigations. We're going to talk about all that. We're going to talk about some of the legal problems, and they're interesting in a way, but just from a purely legal perspective, how all these different laws and different jurisdictions and different sovereigns compete against each other. But it's unfortunate that a lot of times people do fall through the cracks, and there is a real feeling, particularly on these reservations, that the strong sort of are able to lord over the weak and take advantage of them. And you see that in some of the statistics that we're going to talk about. And we always say every victim deserves justice, and we don't get all caught up like some people do on who are you focusing on and who are you talking about, because every case we talk about is important to the family and to the victim. But I do think this renewed focus on this is important, and Ashley has sort of come to be the face of this movement in a lot of ways. And there are a lot of people out there who are missing or they've been murdered, and those cases haven't been solved. And I will say, I think increased pressure in this area is important, and here's a reason why. A lot of people will ask us, wish you would cover more of these types of cases, and we would love to cover them, but we are not journalists and we are not investigators. And all we can do is take the publicly available information and look at it, digest it, analyze it, and tell you about it. There's not a lot of information on these cases. Ashley's case is famous. There's not a lot of information on her case. If you listen to Up and Vanished, when the season that covered Ashley ended, honestly, there wasn't a lot more information than what we already had. There's just not a lot out there. Mainstream media doesn't really cover these cases, and until they do, it's hard for people like us to shine a light on it. So I think the fact that people are putting more and more pressure on those kind of outlets to look at these cases will help. It's like a trickle-down effect. If there's more reporting, there's more information, it's easier for people like us to do it. So hopefully that will continue. But for now, let's focus on this case, and let's talk a little bit about Ashley. So Ashley Loring Heavyrunner was born November 23rd, 1996, on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana. Some of y'all, I just want to point this out. In the United States, Indian is still the term we use to describe Native Americans in the legal world. So reservations are Indian reservations. The Bureau of Indian Affairs handles these issues. There's a museum in Washington, D.C. called the Museum of the American Indian. So I know the terminology can be a little bit delicate. I believe in Canada, it's more First Peoples, maybe, is the way that indigenous people are referred to. But when we mention Indian reservations, just know those are the legal terms, and we're using those. So Ashley, she was studying environmental science at the Blackfeet Community College, and she was sort of at a turning point in her life where she and her sister Kimberly, they had made plans that they were going to go live together in Missoula, Montana. And at this point, Ashley was about 20 years old, and she's thinking she's going to sort of move out into the world with her sister and begin a new life. Ashley had a passion for helping to find missing Indigenous women. It was one of the things she had noticed, one of the things she had focused on growing up in that community. And it was a problem that she knew was an epidemic on reservations around the United States and in Canada.
And Brett, her own focus on a very vulnerable population and population, at risk of being forgotten. And this is, her entire story is really just an incredibly tragic Shakespearean novel, it seems like. But I'm so glad that, you're getting a taste of who she was. Every person is complex, but the fact that she recognized this issue, that it was near and dear to her heart, I think makes this, her story, just that much more poignant.
And Ashley was complex, and she struggled with many of the same problems that a lot of people struggle with, and problems that are particularly endemic on Native American reservations. We're going to talk about some of those in a bit, but she very much was a person who had a dream and a purpose and was beginning to try and live that when something happened. And that's the great mystery of this case, is exactly what happened that cut it short. And that takes us to June of 2017. Ashley heads out to a party at a friend's house. She'd even be seen on video, a video that was posted on Facebook, sitting on a couch, surrounded by beers and happy people, seemingly having a great time, like 1,000 other parties on 1,000 other weekends. But then Ashley seemingly disappeared. After a few weeks, the family reported her missing, but they ran into a brick wall after brick wall. It didn't seem like too many people in the local police department, or even at the federal level, cared too much about finding Ashley. And it turned out, as we've said, that Ashley's case, it wasn't rare. And a case that should have been solved immediately. And that's one of the most frustrating things about this case as we dig into it. You're going to see that. A case that should have been solved immediately turned into a cold case and remains a cold case to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. And like all of our cases, I think the timeline is really important here, especially because we can't quite pinpoint the exact time where Ashley went missing. So the timeline is even more important in these types of cases. So we need to back up a little bit to before Ashley is last seen, because as we said, all of these touch points, they may mean nothing. Ultimately, they may have nothing to do with her disappearance. But when you have so little facts to go on, it's helpful to go back, a couple weeks around the time the person disappeared to assess their state of mind, assess their environment, assess what's going on around them, just to try and draw clues. So though this is part of the timeline, as we've said before, they're important because they are close in time to Ashley's disappearance, but ultimately they might not have anything to do with the story of why she disappeared. But we put it all out there in hopes that someone knows something. So listen closely, because you might have a piece of the puzzle that's missing in order to find her. So at the end of May, Ashley's mom left on a trip. And it was really sad because Ashley's mom actually went into Ashley's room to say goodbye. And when she did that, Ashley asked to go with her. But her mom said, no, just stay with your grandmother. I'll be back soon. Ashley's mother has since spoken about that last time she saw her daughter and said she really regretted it. But there's no way she could have known that this would be the last time she would see Ashley. And there was nothing special about that conversation. Ashley just wanted to come with her, and this wasn't, the right time for her to come.
And, you see this in so many cases. It is tragic because those people carry it with them. We talked about the Murdaugh case and how Maggie Murdaugh's sister, she asked her sister, should she go to the property that day? She didn't really want to go. She wanted to stay on the beach. And her sister was like, no, you should go. You should be with Alec. His dad's sick. And so she did go, and she ended up being murdered. And her sister blames herself for that to this day. And like Alice said, you never know. Obviously, you didn't intend that, but we see this over and over again in these cases. And, you never know when this is going to be the thing that makes a huge difference in your life. And it's only when you're looking back on it in retrospect that you realize how important these kind of conversations were.
And I think this is important too, because her mom is leaving and she's staying with her grandmother. When you're staying with someone you may not stay with all the time, they may not know your comings and goings as well as someone who is typically living day-to-day life with you. And so the fact that Ashley disappears while her mom is gone is, I think, a big factor in why we know so little about her disappearance. No one really knew anything was wrong until her mother came back, but we'll get to that. So on June 5th, 2017, Ashley reaches out to friends on Facebook Messenger to see if they could give her a ride into town. She packs a small bag and her grandmother watches her leave. Now remember, Ashley's 20 years old, so she's not a young child. She is staying with her grandmother, but we're not talking about someone who is so young that they can't go around town, unsupervised. So this is pretty normal, in fact, and appropriate because she's a young adult. A video later shows her at a party with others. And later that night, she sends a message to her sister, Kimberly, who she's very close to. But Kimberly's not in the United States. She is, at this time, in Morocco. And in this message to Kimberly, Ashley asks if Kimberly can send her some money. Kimberly says she can't, given that she's in Morocco, but she cares about her sister and asks if Ashley is okay. And Ashley responds that, yes, she's fine. On June 6, 2017, according to a man named Sam McDonald, Ashley joined him at his remote lakeside cabin. Sam claimed that she stayed with him until June 11th, so about a week. At that point, she asked him to drive her to a roadside pull-off to meet a man named V-Dog, who we'll talk about later. According to Sam, the two of them had been partying for several days straight. Sam passed out at that point, and when he woke up, Ashley was gone. I think it's worth noting here, when we hear this story, we do hear that she stayed with this guy, Sam, for about a week, and that he passes out and doesn't know what happens next. What's kind of implicit here, but I think it's important for the story, and it's not to denigrate anyone, not to denigrate Sam, not to denigrate Ashley. They weren't just hanging out at the lake, having a chill lake weekend. There were substances involved, and that factors into Sam not remembering things and also factors into what happened during those few days. We don't know exactly what it was, but I think it's fair to say that substances were involved. I don't know what substances, but something was involved. It wasn't just like a fishing trip at the lake.
Yeah, and we're gonna spend a lot of time on that because I think it is an important part of this story. A couple things to point out. It is a lot of things came together to make this happen. Alice has already talked about that. Her mom is gone. She's gone on a trip. Her sister, who she's planning on moving in with, is gone. And as a matter of fact, the day that Ashley disappears is actually the day that her sister is coming back from Morocco. So it's even more striking. We have given you the story as it's often presented in articles online. I will say, if you've listened to Up and Vanished, you know that there's a tweak on this June 5th thing. There's a story that's told in that podcast that Ashley, before she left, she sort of runs into her dad's house and shuts all the blinds and says something along the lines of she saw something she shouldn't see and that maybe there's someone outside looking for her. And then at some point she leaves and she's never seen again. And I don't know exactly what happened here. The fact that she went to a party after this makes me wonder if that story is not based so much in fact as sort of a reimagining of what actually happened. The story that's been reported up to this point, to me, is much more realistic. That Ashley always intended to go to a party. She expected to be gone for a little while. She packed a small bag and asked for a ride into town and then went into town. I think that's more consistent. I think it's not impossible that she had, quote unquote, seen something she shouldn't seen, and maybe that has something to do with her disappearance, but I don't really think you need that to get to where we're going to get to, especially as you look at the facts of this case. So maybe that happened. It was the first time I'd ever heard that story. Maybe it happened. I'm not sure. On Sam, we're going to talk about him. We're going to talk about V-Dog. This is a case where it is possible that Ashley was kidnapped and killed by some random person passing through the reservations. Absolutely possible. Unfortunately, reservations are the kind of places that predators like to go because they know all the problems that we've talked about. But I think it is likely that one of the people we're going to talk about probably knows what happened to Ashley. We can't know that for sure, obviously, but she was with some people for a lot of time. And after she was with those people, she disappeared. And these people have been the focus of this case, and I think they'll remain the focus of this case for good reason. So that brings us up to June 6th. As Alice said, you got Sam. We're going to talk more about him and these days they spent together. He says that he drops her off, and then this other person picks her up. At that point, basically, that's the last sort of solid thing we have on this. At this point, Ashley kind of goes missing. 2 weeks later, someone says they saw a young woman running from a vehicle on Highway 89 on the reservation in a desolate area surrounded by swamps and forest near the town of Babb. When you initially hear this, you think, okay, that seems like a crazy sighting, number one. Number two, you wonder if this person immediately reported that because it seems like something you should immediately report, but little unclear about when exactly they did this. We know that they believe they saw this the same night, June 11th, is when they saw this happen. So the same night Ashley goes missing, they see this person sort of running from a vehicle in this area. It takes a couple weeks for that to get reported, but that's what they saw. You might think initially, what are the chances that's Ashley? And unfortunately, that's probably not a question you shouldn't ask, because as we've said, there's so much violence going on in this area, and there's so many women being targeted, and there are so many reasons this could be happening. This could be something as simple as a quarrel between two people. But given the fact that it happened the very night that Ashley disappeared, this was something people focused on, and there was a search in this area to see if they could find anything related to Ashley, and wouldn't you know it, they did. A gray sweater was found that matched one belonging to Ashley. In addition to this sweater, there was also a pair of red-stained boots that were located. And these items were not only near where this person saw a woman matching Ashley's description running, they also weren't that far away from Sam McDonald and his cabin. So you would think, okay, great. We now have some evidence, some red-stained boots. There might be some blood on those. Man, we're going to find out so much information. And so these items were given to the authorities, who promptly misplaced them, which is exactly what you would expect. Now, fortunately, in the years...
I mean, that's just so sad, Brett.
It is sad. It is sad. Fortunately, in the years since, they have found these items. But it's unclear if any testing's been done, if anything happened to the items, and sort of the intervening time period that's going to prevent them from being useful in this case. This is one of those areas where we have this sort of black box, and we don't know as much as we would like to know about this case. Obviously, we hope these items are being tested, and you would hope they lead to something. I'm just glad they found them again.
And I don't know, what led to the items being misplaced, but this is what Brett and I were talking about earlier. There are lots of chain of custody paperwork that you have to do in order to mark all the evidence that you collect. But when you have kind of overlapping jurisdictions, there's extra paperwork, and the paperwork doesn't exactly match from one jurisdiction to another. They have different form numbers and different ways of documenting things. And we have seen when, things travel from the state to the feds, for example, or back from the feds to the state, paperwork gets a little bungled. Evidence typically doesn't get lost, but it gets lost not because someone left it in their trunk. It gets lost because the paperwork mismatches where it's placed. And so it might be in the wrong locker or in the wrong storage area. And we have both faced this before, where we're like, how could you lose X? How could you lose the gun? It's not that they actually lost the gun. And I want to explain this because people often think, a police officer just literally forgot that, the blood-stained boots were in the back of their car, and they drove off with it and then cleaned their car and threw it away. That's not usually what happens. It's usually like an administrative matter. They put it in some storage unit and they don't know which storage unit it's in. And that's because there's so much evidence collected that usually the evidence isn't just stored in a police station, for example. There's usually so many different places they have to place them that they have storage units. They have other kind of off-site locations that are separate from the actual office space in order to make room for all of the various evidence that is collected. So that's just to give a little light into what it means to misplace evidence, as was done here. And it happens, again, when you have lots of jurisdictions at play.
It happens all the time. And you can imagine how it happens, especially if stuff's moving around. Police officers are signing stuff in, they're signing stuff out, there's a chain of custody, it's going from one place to another. You look at the records, it says it's in one place and it's not. Tracing it back and figuring out where it is can take a while. And sometimes you'll hear about evidence being discovered many years later. Somebody just stumbles upon something. So whenever you hear evidence is lost, doesn't mean it's lost forever. It just means they can't find it. So, this is an example of that.
It's like when I clean my house and I'm like, I'm going to put this in a very safe place. And I know it's in my house. I just don't know where.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly where I put it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. That happens to me much too often. But obviously, it's very serious when you need this for a case to move forward. So, it's humans doing the paperwork, it's humans doing the collecting, and there's going to be human error in this. So it's not necessarily just police incompetence. Like Brett says, it happens way more than you actually probably know. It just often doesn't matter because it's not the only thing you need, or that piece of evidence isn't that important. But in this case, since we have so little to go by, this is important evidence, and I hope they're doing something with it to try and find out something, just to see if this is hers. Like the sweater, see if her DNA's on it. If her DNA's on it, it's probably hers. Because there are lots of gray sweaters. It might not even be her gray sweater. And maybe they know this. We just don't know it as the public yet. On June 8th, Kimberly gets back from Morocco. So just a couple days after Ashley had texted her. And Kimberly says that Ashley and she are very close and they text all the time. But Ashley actually never texts Kimberly to see if she got back to the United States okay. And Kimberly said this was out of the ordinary because Ashley was always communicating with Kimberly. She would certainly do something like make sure Kimberly got home, but she never hears from her. On June 12th, Ashley's mom gets home, but Ashley isn't there. Ashley isn't returning calls, but the family isn't very concerned because it was Ashley's habit to go off the grid on occasion. In this situation, she had packed a bag. Her grandmother had seen her leave. It wasn't surprising that she was gone. Shortly thereafter, however, Ashley's father was put in the hospital. And when Ashley didn't show up to see her father, they knew there was a problem. And this was more than just Ashley's going off the grid on occasion. And they reported Ashley missing to tribal authorities. They were told that Ashley was of age and she could do whatever she wanted to, so the tribal authorities said they couldn't do much. And this is something that, again, this is not the tribal authorities being lazy. It's true. Ashley is 20 years old. She's allowed to leave. She's legal to drive a car, to live on her own, to do whatever she wants. And so, unfortunately, this is a situation where when you're of age and you do have the freedom to do whatever you want independently from your family, that sometimes there isn't too much that the authorities can do unless they know for a fact that there's been a crime or that you are missing. Because Ashley went off on occasion like this and sometimes was off the grid, didn't return calls, didn't text back, this pattern of behavior unfortunately led to authorities not moving as quickly as they should have.
Yeah, and look, I think there's a lot in this case that we're going to talk about that are, there are things that people don't like to talk about, okay? The trope in true crime podcasts is that every victim lights up the room and they're perfect and all this other stuff. And in reality, everyone is complex and every victim is complex. And there's a fine line between victim blaming and victimology. We've talked about this before. When you look at victimology, you're trying to figure out what went wrong and what sort of analysis can you do to try and narrow down who might have been involved in this. And some of that are things that the victim is doing. Doesn't mean you're saying they deserved what happened to them, and that's a big distinction. Here, one of the reasons that people did not recognize that Ashley was missing for a while is that she would go off the grid. on occasion. And she would sort of go away from a week and maybe wouldn't be heard from. And as we're going to talk about, she did engage in some drug use during that time. So even though her family was worried about her, they weren't so worried or thinking that anything like this happened. They thought this was just another time when she was doing that. And maybe when she came back, they would have gotten on to her and maybe they would have said, look, you don't need to do that anymore. But they certainly weren't thinking, we need to call the police. And when they did call the police, they got the kind of response that you see too often in cases like this. Look, police departments, particularly this one, are overwhelmed with the calls they're getting, and they are triaging, and they're trying to figure out, is this a real call or is it not a real call? And sometimes this is incredibly frustrating because it'll be something like, a kid doesn't show up to school and they're like, well, maybe they ran away. And there's no evidence they ran away. They have no history of running away, and it delays them looking into it. And then you wonder, what all did we lose because you spent so much time not looking into it? Here, I think, as Alice said, this is the police department. They looked at the situation. They said, this is something she's done before. Most likely she'll come back. This is not the place that we need to be devoting our resources. And so they didn't. And now when we look at that, we're like, man, how much time was lost? But while I think you can criticize them for this, I think you also just have to recognize the reality of the situation. As we're going to talk about, they are vastly overworked and vastly under-supported. And that is one of the reasons that you see so much violence and crime in these areas. Well, whatever the case, eventually the police start to take it seriously. They start to investigate it, but they don't find much of anything. This is a case that really should have been solved and solved quickly, but they are unable to do it. By February of 2018, the FBI has actually taken over the case at the request of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. As we're going to talk about, a lot of overlapping jurisdictions here. Because this is a reservation, the FBI does have jurisdiction. They can come into it, and they're asked to do so by the BIA. Ashley's family, they are looking for her this whole time. They're not waiting on the police. They're not waiting on the FBI to solve this. They're trying to find evidence on their own. At one point, they search a trailer frequented by two of the people that we're going to talk about here, including V-Dog. And they find a maroon stain beneath a shag carpet. They take a sample, they give it to the authorities. This is another thing that if it's been tested, we don't know. Hopefully they haven't lost it. That was in February of 2018. That's a long time ago now. That's 5 years. What exactly is going on with this, I don't know. Frankly, I hope they tested it and didn't find anything, because if it hasn't been tested up to this point, that's just malpractice.
And Brett, with these sorts of things, another thing just to add on to build the whole picture to let you understand how overworked these jurisdictions are. You put in a request to have these things tested, and the labs are usually overwhelmed, and there's usually, a backlog. And so they don't get to it right away. Even though the test may take, hours to complete, they may be dozens of requests behind. And so sometimes the lab also has human error, and they may just not get to your request because other emergent requests come in. We have an active kidnapping and someone's crossing state lines and they have eyes on them and they need something tested right away. And so that request jumps the line. And maybe so many requests jump the line that your request languishes in the line unless you have a detective who keeps calling. The squeaky wheel does get the oil. I've been that squeaky wheel before where I call repeatedly a lab, like, have you gotten to my sample? Have you gotten to my sample? I have a court date coming up. I need that sample tested. Unless that happens, sometimes those just sit there because no one's pushing them forward. And so when you don't have active eyes on it, which you may forget because you as an investigator may have dozens, maybe hundreds of requests for these samples to be tested, that you can't possibly follow up on every single one of them if it's not an active case. And you now begin to see kind of the snowball effect of how a cold case becomes a cold case. No one's calling about it, so it falls further in the line, and there's not an urgent request. No one's annoying you to get things done, and so it never gets done. And then before long, so much time has passed, and everyone has kind of forgotten that you're waiting on anything in a case. And this is just a feature of overworked labs and investigators, and kind of the massive amount of investigations that are present and open at any time in an investigator's office.
And I'll tell you, and a lot of you know this, the clearance rate for murder cases continues to drop in the United States. I think now it's down to close to 50%, which is really bad. And you would think with the technology we have, it would be much higher. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of these forensics people, labs, state labs, are underfunded and understaffed. And there's a massive backlog in testing evidence, as we all know. And until we take that seriously and prioritize that, it's probably only going to continue. Ashley's case continued to grow more and more famous and to really become the face of missing and murdered Indigenous women. In December of 2018, Ashley's name is finally added to the NamUs database, and Kimberly, her sister, actually testifies before Congress about many of the problems that the reservations, and particularly women on the reservations, are facing.
Yeah, and this is so wonderful that Kimberly has taken really a tragedy to shine a light on a much bigger issue. It's terrible that her sister is becoming the face of this issue, but the more kind of our lawmakers hear about it, the better. Because if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., it's hard for people who've lived in Washington, D.C. and work in Washington, D.C., i.e. your elected politicians, to know what life is like on an Indian reservation hundreds of thousands of miles away. But this is a very real issue that could be
hundreds
resolved.
of thousands of miles is a little...
Sorry, hundreds of miles, thousands of miles away. I was going to say hundreds of miles and thousands of miles. You're all the way up in space. I'm still on the cosmonauts episode, Brett. Give me some grace. Thousands of miles from where they are. And, this is something where more resources really can help not solve the issue, but alleviate the issue. If you had more investigators, if you had more resources to combat this, it is kind of a cycle. The more people know that these crimes will be vigorously investigated and prosecuted, the less likely, risk-benefit analysis, criminals want to commit crimes in these jurisdictions. But when they know that these clearance rates are so low that few people are looking at these missing and murdered cases at all, then, the risk of committing crimes in these areas is just low enough that someone on the edge may decide to move forward with those crimes, but not so if you have kind of more resources, more police, more law enforcement on the case. So we've kind of teased around the edges of some people who are of interest in this case, of interest just in that they see Ashley and they are with Ashley around the time she disappears, and that's why they're of interest, because you're always looking at who they're with and what that person may know. And the first that comes to mind is Sam McDonald. After the death of Ashley's grandfather and a failed relationship, Ashley began to experiment with drugs. And unfortunately, this is not something that's uncommon. Tragedy in our lives, whether it be with a death of a loved one or a difficulty in relationship, can lead people to dull the pain. And oftentimes people turn to drugs to kind of lose that immense sad feeling. And I don't know what Ashley was facing, but the fact that her experimentation with drugs followed two pretty big events in her life that were difficult in a young person's life is not surprising, and something we see often on the Indian reservation and off. And Ashley also began to find some older friends, and one of these older friends included Sam McDonald. Now, Ashley, remember, was 20 at the time of her disappearance. Sam was actually in his 50s. McDonald is an admitted drug user, and he claimed to have spent 6 days with Ashley around when she disappeared, specifically using meth. Now, Sam's property has been searched many times with no results. Sam says that he and Ashley spent between June 5th and June 11th together, and that they spent that time at his lakeside cabin property. This is really interesting because what day does Ashley's mom come home? The next day, June 12th. And the only person that can really put Ashley at Sam's cabin is Sam. And that's a lot of days, 6 days. So we really don't have any independent corroboration that she is there versus somewhere else. And if Sam is using meth, even if Sam is telling the truth, he may not have a great grasp on time. Whatever the situation there. At some point, Sam says that he does give Ashley a ride to somewhere on the road where she met up with V-Dog, and that was at the request of Ashley. And while waiting on V-Dog to show up, they're kind of sitting there idling. Sam, who had been up for 6 days straight on kind of a drug binge, passes out. And he says he remembers nothing from there. So in his telling of the story, he's in the car with Ashley, waiting for V-Dog to show up. But before V-Dog shows up, he passes out. And the next thing he knows, Ashley is gone.
Angi has made it easier than ever to connect with skilled professionals to get all your home projects done well.
If you own a home, you know how much work it can take. Whether it's everyday maintenance and repairs or making dream projects a reality, it can be hard just to know where to start. But now, all you need to do is Angi that and find a skilled local pro who will deliver the quality and expertise you need.
And Alice, you can turn to Angi with confidence no matter what the size of your home or the size of your project. Whether you've got a 100-year-old house like I do, where it seems like things are always breaking, or if you're renting and you're needing someone to help you with moving, installations, or cleaning, Angi is there for you, and they're there for you with confidence. So, Angi has over 20 years of home service experience, and they've combined it with new tools to simplify the whole process. Bring them your project online or with Angi's app, answer a few questions, and Angi can handle the rest from start to finish. Or they can help you compare quotes from multiple pros and connect instantly, which means you can take care of just about any home project in just a few taps. Because when it comes to getting the most out of your home, you can do this when you Angi that. Download the free Angi mobile app today or visit Angi.com. That's ANGI.com. Check them out today. Angi.com. ANGI.com. Alice, I think if there's one thing we've all experienced, it's when you have something wrong with you and you want to go to the doctor, but man, finding a doctor these days is so hard. And that's where our sponsor, Zoc Doc, comes in. You know, I'm sure there are many of you out there who have been stewing about a health problem you have, and you almost resort to texting your group of friends to see what they think. But unless you're very lucky and your group of friends includes a bunch of doctors, you're probably not going to find the quality medical advice that you need. You're also not going to find it on social media. You're not going to find it on TikTok. And Google can be great, but you probably don't want to trust that either. And that's where Zoc Doc comes in. They help you find expert doctors and medical professionals that specialize in the care you need and deliver the type of experience you want.
Brett, Zoc Doc is the only free app that lets you find and book doctors who are patient-reviewed, take your insurance, are available when you need them, and treat almost every condition under the sun. No more doctor roulette or scouring the internet for questionable reviews. With Zoc Doc, you have a trusted guide to connect you to your favorite doctor you haven't met yet. Millions of people use Zoc Doc's free app to find and book a doctor in their neighborhood who's patient-reviewed and fits their needs and schedule just right. As a mom of now 3 little ones, I can tell you this is such a valuable app to not have to look for specialized doctors for all of my kids who have the weirdest illnesses. Go to ZocDoc.com/prosecutors and download the Zoc Doc app for free. Then find and book a top-rated doctor today. Many are available within 24 hours. That's ZocDoc.com/prosecutors. ZocDoc.com/prosecutors. The Prosecutors Podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. How much time do you spend on yourself in a given week versus how much time you spend on other people? And how do you balance the two? I know with now 3 little ones, I struggle with this a lot because I have the podcast, my full-time job, and all of my duties as a mom. It's so easy to get caught up in what everyone else needs from you and never take a moment to think about what you need for yourself. But when we spend all of our time giving, it can leave us feeling stretched thin and burned out. Therapy gives you the tools to find more balance in your life, and that's where BetterHelp can really come in handy.
That's right, Alice. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapist anytime for no additional charge. Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/prosecutors today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/prosecutors. Alice, I think all our listeners know that you're bilingual. For me, I can barely speak English, and I can tell you, I tried to learn Spanish in high school, and it was rough. It wasn't exactly the high point in my academic career. And as much as I wanted to know another language, I really could just never do it. And I am so excited to talk about Babbel. I love Babbel, and it is the learning language app that sold more than 10 million subscriptions for a reason. It's addictively fun and an easy way to learn a new language. Whether it be traveling abroad, connecting in a deeper way with family, or just have some free time, Babbel teaches bite-sized language lessons that you actually use in the real world. I'm busy, you guys are busy, I totally get it. The great thing about Babbel is it only takes a few minutes, 15 minutes a day or so, to go through one of these lessons, and you will find yourself learning new languages. It is an amazing thing. You have to try it.
It really is amazing, Brett. Their teaching method has been scientifically proven to be effective. With Babbel, you can choose from 14 different languages, including Spanish, French, Italian, and German. Plus, Babbel's speech recognition technology helps you improve your pronunciation and accent. There are so many ways to learn with Babbel. In addition to lessons, you can access podcasts, games, videos, stories, and even live classes. Plus, it comes with a 20-day money-back guarantee. So start your new language learning journey today with Babbel. Right now, get up to 55% off your subscription when you go to babbel.com/prosecute. That's babbel.com/prosecute for up to 55% off your subscription. Babbel, language for life. Brett, I know I've told you this a lot, but I feel like I am always running to the store to buy meat for my growing boys. They love all types of meat, and I just cannot get enough high quality meat for them. And it's so expensive when I go to the store. That's where ButcherBox comes in. ButcherBox has high quality meat and seafood you can trust because it's 100% grass-fed beef, free-range organic chicken, pork-raised, crate-free, and wild-caught seafood. And it's all humanely raised, no antibiotics or added hormones. I feel at peace serving the highest quality meats from ButcherBox to my family. And the best part, it gets delivered right to your door, so I don't even have to spend time going to the grocery store every week to look for these meats.
That's exactly right, Alice. I think what everybody's looking for right now is quality that's convenient and that's cheap. And ButcherBox, it gives you that. Not only is it delivered right to your front door, it's free shipping always. And we're talking incredible value here, guys. A variety of high quality cuts at an amazing value with exclusive member deals, recipe inspirations, guides, tips, and hacks. And ButcherBox, as they often do, is giving us a special deal. This one's crazy. Sign up today using code PROSECUTE to receive ground beef for a year plus $20 off your first order. That's 2 pounds of ground beef free in every box for a year plus $20 off your first order when you sign up at butcherbox.com/prosecute and use code prosecute. What are you waiting for, guys? Get that ground beef delivered straight to you. Sign up today, butcherbox.com/prosecute and use code prosecute. And Ashley's drug use is a big part of this story. It's a part of the story that's not often discussed, but it's really important. If you listen to Up and Vanish, you've heard an interview with Sam. Sam is one of those people who he tells this story, and you really have to question what is true and what is not true. It's possible it all is. It's also possible, frankly, that Sam killed Ashley very shortly after she arrived, and everything else he says is a fantasy. It's also probable that Ashley, if she was with him, she was doing some pretty serious drugs. He said that at times she would just leave even his place and kind of disappear for hours on end. And one time she kind of came back and she was very high on something. He wasn't sure what. He didn't think it was meth based on the way she was talking, but she was very high on that. And she, at some point, Sam was like, look, let me just take you home. And she didn't want to go home. She wanted to meet this V-Dog character we're going to talk about in a minute. For those of you out there who don't use meth, I'm one of those people, it may surprise you, this story. It may seem absolutely unbelievable that Sam was with her and then just passes out. But one of the things that happens with people who go on a meth binge is exactly this. They stay up for days on end. Days and days and days doing meth, drinking Cokes, and eating junk food, and then at some point, they just smash right into a wall and collapse, and they may not wake up for a week. And it actually is pretty consistent with what Sam's saying. He's driving her to this place. He's probably coming off the meth a little bit. They're sitting waiting on V-Dog, and he hits that wall and he collapses. And then when he wakes up, she's gone. So it may sound convenient, and maybe it is, but it also isn't entirely inconsistent with what happens to people who use meth. We've mentioned him many times. V-Dog. Who is this V-Dog? Does he exist, or did Sam completely make him up? He did not. V-Dog is a nickname for Paul Valenzuela. He is another 50-year-old man with several criminal convictions on his record for burglary and weapons charges, and we are led to believe that Ashley and Valenzuela were in some sort of relationship. Now, at the time, he was actually married to another woman, Tashina T. Running Crane. Now, Tashina T. is not a random person. She is actually Ashley's cousin. And it was their trailer that we mentioned earlier that the family was searching when they found the stain that could be blood or could just be a stain. What we know for certain is that a month after Ashley went missing, T filed for divorce. Now, Sam says that T and Paul know where Ashley is. That's sort of his position. In a YouTube video posted in September of 2017, T can be heard saying that Paul has Ashley and everyone knows it. And Paul is trying to set her up. They obviously don't have that great a relationship. After that, they actually reconciled, and T said that she and Paul were in Seattle when Ashley disappeared. Now, what's interesting, though, is that they have since had a falling out yet again. And now T says that they were in Seattle, and that at some point, Paul actually kind of leaves her, and she doesn't know where he goes, and he disappears for a while. Now, Venezuela was helpfully under court-ordered supervision at the time of the disappearance. As we said, he's had several convictions on his record. And on June 9th, 2017, which is 2 days before Sam says that Ashley disappeared, Valenzuela informed officials that he was actually going to be coming back from Seattle to the Blackfeet Nation to pick up some of his belongings. So that's pretty interesting, right? This sort of confirms a little bit of what T's saying. Yes, they went to Seattle, but it doesn't actually give him the alibi that they had said he had before. And in fact, he had told officials that he was going to come back to the reservation. Now, you may be thinking, if he was going to do that and go murder somebody, he probably wouldn't tell the police, hey, I'm going back to where the murder's going to occur. Obviously, if there was a murder, it wasn't planned. It was something that just happened. So the timing works out pretty well. In October of that year, he would actually receive a 20-month sentence on weapons charges. I believe he is now out. The home of T and Valenzuela has been searched by law enforcement on multiple occasions to no avail. And like so many other things in this case, this, while tantalizing, up to this point is a dead end.
And it's just, I mean, with both of these men, Sam and Paul, the dates are just, they're all intertwined and they're all likely stories and they're all a little bit suspect because with Sam, you know, he sees Ashley until conveniently the day before Ashley's mother realizes she's missing. Same with Paul. He is in her life. He's not some made up person that Sam just made up. So Sam knew enough about Ashley's life and kind of her goings on with other people. And you can see how T is not going to be a very reliable narrator because we do, at least through rumors, know that there may have been some sort of an affair happening with T's own husband and Ashley. That would make anyone furious, understandably so, especially when you are first angry at, you know, your husband and then you try to protect them. We see this all the time, especially with rocky relationships and witnesses. We will have oftentimes a woman who is on the government side. They want to testify to put their former lover in prison for some heinous crime. But then in between the time that they come in and say they want to be testifying witness and the time that court happens, they've reconciled with their now lover and they no longer want to testify against them and they want to protect them. And if they take the stand, they may tell lies or at least a story that's inconsistent with what they told law enforcement previously. And it kind of ping pongs back and forth. And it's a very fraught situation. So what's happening here with T and Paul's stories and how they're changing is actually, unfortunately, very consistent with what we've seen with witnesses. And they may know more. I think they definitely know more, right? We just don't know what it is.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see why this case is so frustrating, because you've got these 3 people who are obvious suspects for different reasons. You have Sam, who admits to being with her immediately before she disappeared, and in fact spending a few days with her. You have Paul, who Sam says is the person he connected her with afterwards, who she also was in a relationship with. And you have Paul's ex-wife, who might not have been too happy with the fact that they were in a relationship. And you just think, if there had been any investigation done into this case, any competent investigation, surely they would have found some evidence to either rule these people out or rule them in. Were people's cell phones dumped? Did they do any kind of forensic evaluation of what was happening with pings? Was there a geofence? These are all questions, the answers to which are probably no, unfortunately. And unfortunately also, a lot of that evidence is probably just gone now. I just feel like if they had done any kind of investigation here, this wouldn't be a mystery, because it feels so solvable. None of these people are master criminals. And like I said, I think they either would have been ruled out or ruled in really quickly had there been a good, competent investigation done.
And, another thing that this is why we think it's really important to talk about Ashley's drug use, not because it's, an indictment on her character, but rather when we, law enforcement, hear of someone who's been on, say, a meth binge for 6 days and then they are not answering calls, oftentimes law enforcement thinks, oh, the person is just maybe passed out somewhere. They're not actually in danger. They have passed out because of their own drug use, and we're going to actually focus on this kidnapped child instead, because, we have leads on that. We know where to go in that investigation. And so I do think it's very important here to recognize the vulnerable population. Ashley didn't want to be where she was. She obviously was advocating for women in her exact position. And she probably even knew that she was in a more vulnerable position because of the fact that she was a woman, that she was living on an Indian reservation, and even with her drug use. And so she knew these things, and yet with her advocacy, it still kind of didn't break through to law enforcement. And I bet you someone got the call and probably was just like, oh, just another girl. Hi, she'll turn up somewhere. They didn't think that it was going to lead to where we are today, which is that we have no leads, and she is still missing to this day. Now, we've talked about this, but let's talk a little bit more about the epidemic of missing Native women, because what's happening when we say that there's an epidemic of this population? In 2016, there were nearly 6,000 Indigenous women reported missing. That's only the ones who were reported. Only 116 of these were logged in the National Missing Persons Database, according to the Urban Indian Health Institute. In Montana, although Native American women make up only 4% of the population, they account for 30% of the missing. The murder rate for Native women is 10 times higher than the national average and the third leading cause of death. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is responsible for investigating serious crimes on the reservation, and because the tribe is a quasi-sovereign, it's empowered to arrest and punish its own tribal members. But tribal officers cannot arrest non-tribal members who commit crimes in Indian country. Let that sink in for a second. They can only arrest their own tribal members. In other words, a non-tribal member, like you or me, Brett, if we're driving through Indian country and we commit a crime, murder, something really serious, the Bureau of Indian Affairs cannot arrest us, even for such a heinous crime, because we are not tribal members. I mean, that is like the loophole that swallows all of this. I mean, there's a beautiful description of this in the book that I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, The Roundhouse. And you see kind of why it's so tricky with all these different sovereigns, because there begins to be jurisdictional creep when, where does it stop if the Bureau of Indian Affairs can arrest anyone or if they can arrest no one? And so none of this is meant to create the situation that we now have, which is that there is a very vulnerable population because of these strange overlapping jurisdictions and limited jurisdictions, even among the sovereigns. But it is the situation, and it's helpful to know why these kind of massive loopholes have led to the devastating situation that we're in today. So what happens in that situation? Because the Bureau of Indian Affairs can't arrest a non-tribal member for these crimes committed on their reservation, the tribe actually has to work with state and federal authorities. And this kind of cooperation, it's not a one-size-fits-all because crimes are messy, the situations are messy, the tribal members, if the tribal members, not tribal members, know exactly where, the crime happens in terms of geography matters. Because of that, it's not always clear how this patchwork of jurisdictions have to work together. And as a result, no one really exactly knows what they're doing in any situation because there's not a tried and true kind of path you always take when X happens. And it leads to a complete mess. And a mess leads to administrative nightmares where evidence gets lost and no one quite knows who's in charge of the investigation. And what are you going to do? You're going to prioritize what you have to be investigating at that time. So the feds are going to prioritize cases they know are federal cases. The state's going to prioritize cases they know are state cases. And what happens when everyone is prioritizing something else than the Indian reservation case we have before us? We have kind of forgotten cases.
And like Alice said, this is a particular problem when you have a case like this where you don't actually know what happened, because you have situations where, who's the victim? Who's the perpetrator? Are they an Indian or are they not an Indian? What exactly is the crime? Tribes can't charge anyone with a major crime. So if it is murder or rape or something serious like that, that actually has to fall to the federal agencies. You actually have to have the federal government handle that, not the state. State doesn't handle that. It's the federal government. And as we said, this really creates the perfect breeding ground for serious crime, where you can have people who prey on the weak and have almost no consequences. And a lot of this, it doesn't come from a place of evil. This is part of the complicated and often not good history of the United States and the tribes. Those of you who know anything about history know that this was a long-going thing about what was going to be tribal land and what wasn't. The whole state of Oklahoma was originally supposed to be a tribal reservation, and recently there was a Supreme Court case that actually took a large portion of Oklahoma and put it under tribal authority, under the theory of, look, this was the agreement, we're going to honor the agreement. And that is a case we could talk about a lot on Legal Breeze, because what's happened is now you have the federal government is having to enforce all these criminal laws that no one else can enforce. And so laws that you might think of as state laws, like murder and robbery and that kind of stuff, now the federal government's having to enforce. And so you have this situation where there is this very strange, difficult to figure out sovereign within a sovereign within a sovereign. You have an Indian reservation, which is sovereign to a certain extent. Then you have a state, which is sovereign to a certain extent. The Indian reservation is in the state, and then the state is in the country, which is obviously sovereign to the full extent. And how exactly they're going to figure things out when it comes down to individual cases can be really complicated and confusing. And when time matters and evidence needs to be processed and not lost, you see that. And you saw that in this case, as we talked about. After they decided she was missing, the tribal police, they did conduct a 3-day search for Ashley. But after that, they pretty much stopped and washed their hands of it. And then there was no one to help except the BIA. It took them 2 months to start investigating Ashley's disappearance, a massive amount of time in any case, but in particularly in a case like this. The problem for them, the reservation we've been talking about covers 1.5 million acres. For point of reference, that is larger than the state of Delaware. Delaware is not a huge state. It's still bigger than the state. They have 17 officers to cover that entire area. I'm going to go out on a limb and say the state of Delaware, small, wonderful state that it is, probably has more than 17 police officers to enforce the law. So that's the kind of situation and the manpower overload that they're looking at. And when you realize these facts, we start off with this case saying, how is this case not solved? This case should have been solved. Well, there's your answer. The answer is there's no one to solve it. And there was no one trying to solve it. And that puts us where we're at with a case that a young lady has been missing for 6 years, and we're no closer to finding her or what happened to her than we were when it started.
Man, when you put those numbers, they're so stark. 17 for that amount of space. And also you add on kind of unfortunately, our Indian reservations are also riddled with drug addiction problems. And that also goes back to a long history that we can go into in another episode. But when you add on kind of the drug addiction and the challenges that brings, because we've talked about how any mind-altering drug means that people don't typically act in the way that you expect them to. And so a typical missing person, maybe there's like a typical path you'll follow to begin your investigation. But when you add mind-altering drugs, everything kind of goes to the wind in terms of what is common or what is expected or what is, rational to be doing in that situation. And that's just so difficult for such a small force to have to contend with. So let's go into theories then. The first one is a very obvious one, is that Ashley disappeared on her own. As with any missing persons case, it's possible that Ashley went off on her own. Now, there were sightings of Ashley as far away as Washington and New Mexico, but none of those panned out. And honestly, it doesn't really make sense. Ashley had plans to move in with her sister in Missoula, where she would continue her education. And as recent as June 5th, Ashley was still texting with her sister, and there was no indication that she was rethinking plans of moving in with Kimberly or rethinking her education plans. And remember, she did have a passion in life. She wanted to be an advocate, a voice for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And there was nothing that was changing about kind of that passion. And she did not have significant resources. She didn't have a ton of money to be able to just pick up and move to an entirely different state. And it's hard to imagine how she could pull off a disappearance without those resources and having been around people. She had her grandmother. She had her mother who was going to be back within the week. She had another sister who was home with her, a younger sister. She had Kimberly who was coming back from Morocco. All these people were connected to her. She wasn't someone who was a loner and completely disconnected from friends and family. In fact, she was very connected. And those strong connections is really the reason why there was any search for her at all, even if it were delayed.
And I'm not saying that no one ever goes on a drug bender and disappears and decides to leave their life behind. I'm sure that does happen. But I think that's usually just more of an excuse that's used by people in police departments, unfortunately, who don't want to investigate a case. And they're just like, oh, well, she probably just decided to go off and start a new life. She probably went with a drug dealer somewhere, something like that. That didn't happen here. If she went somewhere, she was taken there. And I think that's pretty clear. She would have come back. If she had just gone and done a lot of meth and then sobered up, she would have come back. She wouldn't have disappeared. And she certainly would have come back by now. Now, another option is that she was trafficked. As I said, if she went somewhere, she could have gone with someone else. Now, human trafficking is a problem. It is often used really in kind of ridiculous ways to provide a solution, a possible solution to a case in which there's no way it's human trafficking. Human trafficking is not you're walking down the street and somebody rides by and throws you in a van and then traffics you. That's not how it works. In reality, it is the trafficking of people who are in vulnerable positions. Oftentimes, they're people who are looking for work. Maybe they're in the country illegally. They are trafficked by people who move them around the country to do different jobs. Oftentimes, women in that situation can also be prostituted. And that also happens with people who are homeless or are seriously addicted to drugs. I mean, that's where you see this a lot. And that's when you see prosecutions of human trafficking, those tend to be the victims that you see.
Brett and I have seen these cases, and we've had them go to trial, where the victims, when you see them on the stand, I mean, it's a very difficult situation, and especially when it comes to young women and drugs. It may start out as a situation where they will do anything for their next high. And so these usually men, pimps, kind of take advantage of it. And at first it's a friendly relationship. They're not being trafficked. They're just a friend helping out another friend. You can allow me to sell my body to another man and you get to keep the money, but pimp, you get to give me my next high. But then the situation gets worse, and then all of a sudden the woman is not allowed to leave, and they are both addicted to the drugs and they have no resources because Usually the pimp takes everything of theirs, their phone, their money, their earnings. They have no earnings, the clothes on their back or no clothes. Like literally, we've had this situation where victims, when they're asked, why didn't you run away? They said they were literally naked in a hotel room. They couldn't go anywhere without being naked. And that was a control mechanism to keep these trafficked women there. And it just builds on itself. And these women are usually kept on high amounts of drugs so that they can't run away, so that they can't think clearly for themselves. And they can't make sense of right or wrong. Even if they typically did drugs on their own, they are kept at such an altered state in order to control them that being trafficked snowballs. And then all of a sudden we're talking about years where they are under the control of someone else who has utter control of their mind, body, and soul.
And trafficking has been a problem on the Blackfeet Reservation. We know that. So this would not be something entirely unusual, particularly you add in the drugs, and it's certainly possible that Ashley was trafficked. Now, the problem is it's almost impossible to trace something like this. If she were trafficked, we won't know unless she's picked up somewhere by law enforcement or, unfortunately, if they find her body. There's not much evidence that she was trafficked, though her family has heard rumors that she had been shipped off to Washington. Seattle comes up a lot in this story, and you have to wonder if in fact that's what happened. And in some ways, as awful as that would be, it's probably the best outcome because it means it's possible that Ashley could be found alive at some period.
And man, the horrors of trafficking, I think, cannot be overstated here. And this is just a PSA because you might be helping someone, you might be helping Ashley directly, but if you see a situation where you think trafficking is happening, and it happens really everywhere, unfortunately. It happens not just at places like the Super Bowl, where there's been a big publicity push for people to recognize trafficking in those high traffic areas where a lot of people are coming in from all over the world or all over the country. But they happen in seemingly small towns, and you'll see them and you'll notice them because it's usually women who are staying very close to someone and they're not allowed to make their own choices at all. And if you see something, just go ahead and call it in. I mean, worst case scenario, you've created an embarrassing situation, but maybe you are saving someone's life as well. Because often people don't recognize they're being trafficked until it's too late, especially if we're talking about vulnerable populations, young women, like underage women, or women who are, again, in altered states. So there's that. Now, another theory, of course, is that Ashley died of some sort of accident. The area in which the sweater was found was rugged, it was swampy, and possibly dangerous, especially if you were on a high. It's possible that after Sam passed out, maybe Ashley was tired of waiting for V-Dog and decided to walk, but she ran into some sort of trouble, whether it was nature or it was someone who wanted to do her harm. But other than that, the sweater and possibly bloody boots that we don't even know are tied to her, there's really no evidence of some sort of natural occurrence. So this is a possibility because, of course, we haven't heard from her, so it's possible she just is dead. We don't have much to go on.
And I think the same can be said for a theory we talked about earlier, which is that this is some sort of random attack. Serial killer, just a random killer. It's obviously possible that Ashley was attacked by some random person. We've talked about how dangerous this area is. It has a high crime rate. There are a lot of people who don't think the law applies to them. You add in the drug trade with Ashley's involvement in drugs. You can't rule it out, but there's no real evidence of it, and it seems much more likely it was someone she knew. This area in particular, everybody talks, and I gotta think, if this were a random person, someone would know that, and they would have flipped on them by now, particularly given how famous this case is. I think this was somebody, if Ashley was killed, it was someone she knew, and they're keeping it a secret because they don't want to be punished for it, and that's sort of the most likely outcome.
And I think that's right, Brett. I do think that whatever happened to her, I don't know if it's trafficked, I don't know if she's no longer with us, someone she knew probably had something to do with this. As we've discussed, there are people whose names have surfaced as possible suspects. Still, other than some strange statements, there's really no evidence tying any of these people to a crime. It's just as likely that Sam, Paul, and T have simply used Ashley's disappearance to get back at each other, and even if they have no real involvement in the case. But as we've mentioned before, their stories all could very likely be bad alibis or good alibis. And there have been searches and investigations into them, and so far they have been fruitless. But the fact that she was enmeshed with people at the time of her disappearance, I think makes it more likely than not that whatever happened to her, it happened in conjunction with someone she knew. In other words, somebody knows something and they're not saying anything. With all that said, if there's anything that you've heard today that triggers your memory, maybe you were driving through this area, maybe you have a friend of a friend who was at a party with Ashley, maybe you know something. And no matter how small it is, it might just be a piece of the puzzle, even if you don't think it's going to solve the case. If you know something, you can call the Blackfeet Law Enforcement Services at 406-338-4000 or the Browning Police Department at 406-338-4000. Well, those are the same number.
Yeah, you get them both. It's the same. They're running out of the same building.
Gosh, there you go.
There you
So
go.
those are the same phone numbers because they run out of the same building. Doesn't matter who you reach out to them. If you don't feel comfortable calling them directly, send us a note. We'll pass along the message. We don't have some special line to the Blackfeet Law Enforcement or Browning Police Department. We'll just call it in for you if you, for some reason, don't want to do the calling yourself, because all we want to do is to get as much information to the police as possible in hopes that if Ashley is alive, I think she's probably living something pretty horrendous because she was very close to her family. And I do think she would have reached out to her family at some point. So I hope that she is alive. But unfortunately, if she is alive, I'm afraid her situation is pretty dire. And every single day that passes is a day that we could be saving her from these horrors. So don't wait another day if you think you know something. It could always be anonymous when you call these tips in. And if you email us, we will, of course, keep your name anonymous unless you want us to give it. But I really hope that someone out there knows something. There are pieces out there that can be investigated. We're not investigating this case. We don't have access to the bloody boots, to the sweater, to the carpet sample. I don't know what's happening there, but if the law enforcement are listening to this, I hope they've run all those to ground and that we simply haven't heard anything because they all came out with negative results. But until there's something more, I don't see this case being solved without some community action.
This is absolutely a case that people know something. There are people out there who know who did this. I know that. This case can be solved. There are cases we do that you want them to be solved, but you just think, man, that's never going to be solved. Unless something really breaks our way, this is not going to be solved. This is not that kind of case. This is a case that should have been solved 5 years ago, and it still can be solved. But at this point, it's not DNA that's going to solve it. It's somebody out there. It's one of you. So pay attention, and hopefully we can get some sort of resolution on this. Alice, the question thing has been very popular. I don't know if you noticed. People really like the 5-star questions.
It is. So literally my baby just started crying. So let's do 2 real quick questions. And you're going to hear a baby crying in the background because you know how real this is.
Well, see, I was going to say, I know we're running a little long, so I was going to do one question.
Okay, one question.
For you. It's a question for you.
Okay.
So this is from Field Hockey 09. Alice, you stated you didn't speak English until you were 7 in one episode. What is your cultural background, and how does that play into you being a lawyer?
Oh, really good question and good listening skills. So I did grow up in the United States, but I was born to an immigrant family and my mom really didn't speak much English. So we only spoke Mandarin Chinese in the home. So my parents are from Taiwan by way of China. And that's my ethnic background. And that's why I only spoke Mandarin, even though I lived in the United States. And by the way, just so you know, that's a lot more common than a lot of people realize, that kind of pockets of immigrants, you'll have people who never speak English here. I mean, we banked at a Chinese bank. We went to Chinese grocery stores where everyone spoke Mandarin. We went to a church that was, Mandarin speaking. And really, I didn't know there was like an entire world out there that spoke English until I went to school. And I just nodded because I thought everyone else didn't speak very well. That's actually completely true. My kindergarten teacher thought that I had like a learning disability because I would smile and nod at everything she said because I just thought she like garbled her words. I didn't realize she wasn't speaking Mandarin. I just assumed that this lady really can't speak very clearly. And how it affects me being a lawyer is that I have cousins born in almost every continent in the world, and I've seen a lot of different government systems and judicial systems at play. And I mean, the United States has its problems, but there are just incredible opportunities for justice is blind here in the United States. And I wanted to be part of that. I've seen a lot of corrupt judicial systems, unfortunately, where my family lives all over the country, not just in Asian countries. And seeing that, I think, instilled in me at a very young age that there was something special here in the United States and it needed to be protected, that it could be lost incredibly easily. One generation and kind of it could all be wiped away. And I wanted to be part of, the generation that kept justice alive because I knew how quickly it could devolve if there weren't protectors of it. So it's probably very Pollyanna of me, but that really is why I went into the law. So great question, Field Hockey.
Yes, thank you, Field Hockey. I love it when Alice talks about that. So always happy to ask that question. My roommate in college didn't speak any English until kindergarten. So as Alice said, it's less rare than you think. It always kind of blew my mind. I can't imagine that. I don't know how you do that, but very impressive, Alice. And we're glad to have you here fighting for freedom and justice.
Well, thank you, Brett. And, my child's like screaming out there. You guys can probably hear it. Sorry, Jason, you're having to do all this noise cancellation. And my child's like, you're not fighting for me.
No, well, we'll go ahead and wrap it up then. prosecutorspod@gmail.com if you guys want to reach out to us for any reason. If you want us to answer a question, leave a 5-star review, leave a question, and we will get to it. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and let Alice get back to her child, but we'll be back next week. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Here we go. It's nice to have you back, Alice. I've missed you. Okie dokie. Here we go. You ready? Here we go. Okay. A gray sweater was found that matched one belonging to Ashley I
love your sound.
In addition, you just relax.
Hi.
Do not stress out.
You're the
You're
best.
stressed out.
I am stressed out.
Stressed out, I
'Cause
can
don't-
tell.
Well, I don't want to, I'm a slacker. I'm sorry.
I can't remember. What do I, adjectives? What do I even call this file? It's been so long since we've done this. Superlatives. I feel like I want
what's streaming free all month long during Amplify AAPI Voices on Pluto TV. Watch shows like Kim's Convenience with Simu Liu and amazing movies like Meet the Patels and Jason Momoa in Braven. Plus, Pluto TV has hundreds of channels with thousands more movies and TV shows available on live and on demand. Download Pluto TV on all your favorite devices for free. Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.